the poster, on Scotty's poster. So you know that she published a collection of essays, My Misspent Youth. Many of you have read a couple of essays from My Misspent Youth. And a novel, The Quality of Life Report. Her third book, which she's going to read from tonight, it will be on the shelves in a matter of moments, practically. How soon? A couple of weeks?
May 4th.
May 4th. That's a couple of weeks to make. That feels like a couple of weeks to me. Anyways, very soon, a new book on the shelves, and it is called Life Would Be Perfect If I Lived in That House. You also know that she went to Vassar and to Columbia, and she's written for Harpers and the New Yorker and the New York Times Book Review and the Village Voice and Vogue and just countless publications. And so here's the funny thing. Megan lives in my neighborhood. So when I met her in the park with her big dog Rex, and she was just such a normal person that I didn't know that she was that Megan. So I didn't know that she was the Megan who regularly, on a weekly basis, makes me laugh and cry and think, which is, you know, challenging. Because Megan writes a weekly column. She's been writing since November 2005 for the LA Times. So obviously she does it all. And her husband, who's a wonderful writer himself, and he's a journalist, I think he says it best, and he says it with admiration and love and pride and just the teeniest bit of frustration. Alan says she's a natural. And it's true. It's not that Megan doesn't work very hard at what she does. Of course she works very hard, but the work itself is seamless. It's seemingly effortless. It's generous. And that isn't just because of its considerable honesty. It's because Megan trusts the reader to get it. So not only is the work incredibly smart, but she makes us feel smart too. So as I said, as Bridget said, tonight she's going to read from this new book, which I tell you I could not put down. I hated to put down. And then when I finally finished it, I hated that. I hated finishing it. It's a memoir this time. So a collection of essays, a novel, and now a memoir. And it's hilarious and moving and culturally incisive and historically significant, and it's a page-turner too. So I want to remind you, this week some of you read Patricia Hampel, and she says that memoir reaches deep within the personality as it seeks its narrative form, and it also grasps the life of the times as no political analysis can. So that's the first thing you should remember when you're listening tonight. And then Vivian Gornick, in The Situation in the Story, describes a very effective piece of writing like this. She says, structure had imposed order. Order made the sentences more shapely. Shapeliness increased the expressiveness of the language. Expressiveness deepened association. This buildup is called texture. The texture caused me to feel. This feeling resonated in me. So think about that. And then you read Virginia Woolf, and she said of the essay, but I think that applies here, she said, it should lay us under a spell with its first word, and we should only wake refreshed with its last. And so it's my great delight to introduce my friend Megan Daum.
Thank you. I'm so glad I can trust the audience. I'm so glad I can trust the readers. I've just come off of a weekend marathon celebrity profile writing session about the most insipid, I won't say, and I don't think I'm to trust the readers necessarily in that case. So refreshing to be here, and thank you so much, and thank you, Bridget, for having me, and Dinah for everything, for your friendship, for your colleagueship. She has really nice dogs also. One nice dog. So yeah, this book is called Life Would Be Perfect If I Lived in That House. I suppose the title should explain it all, although I was being interviewed the other day by Realtor magazine, which was a real coup that we had landed a profile in Realtor magazine because they have like 7 million subscribers. You know, it's the official magazine of the realtors everywhere. And the editor, she had been, this is a testament to the demise of print and everything else. She had been at Time magazine for 27 years, and she got laid off, and she's now an editor at Realtor magazine. And she said, okay, now I need you to explain your title because a lot of our readers are very literal people. So can you please explain Life Would Be Perfect If I Lived in That House? And I thought, well, that's, it's kind of, I don't know how you could get any more literal than that. So it was kind of downhill from there. So if you get Realtor magazine, read details, my celebrity interview. Anyway, I'm going to read from a couple sections of this. And I'm not used to reading. This is like very new for me, so I may get totally lost and confused, but you're going to have to just bear with me. And I'm going to start from the beginning, so there's not too much to say yet. Yesterday, a piece of my house came off in my hands. I don't mean that metaphorically. I banged the garbage can against an outside wall, and a piece of stucco about the size of a sheet of paper came ever so slightly loose. When I touched it, it fell gently into my palm. It was as if the house was giving me a lock of its hair, or perhaps coughing up phlegm. I was concerned, but it also happened that I was really busy that day. I just couldn't get into it with the stucco. Not right then, anyway. Also, I was coming up on my 5-year anniversary of owning the house. And if there's anything I've learned in 5 years, it's this. If a piece of your house falls off and you don't know what to do with it, throwing it in the trash and forgetting about it is a perfectly viable option. And it so happened that the trash can was right there. Once upon a time, I would have made a beeline to the yellow pages to look up stucco replacement. But I've come a long way since then. So has the house. I bought it in 2004, and as I write this, it's supposedly worth something like $60,000 less than what I paid for it. By the time you read this, it will probably be worth even less than that. I try not to care too much, or even think about it too much, because if I did, I'd go insane. I'd spent enough time here being insane, believe me. I was insane when I bought the place, and I went even more insane afterward. Then again, the whole world was high a few years ago. The whole world, or at least the whole country, was buying real estate and melting it down to liquid form and then injecting it into veins. For my part, it's tempting to say I succumbed to peer pressure, but it was really much more complicated than that. There's no object of desire quite like a house. Few things in this world are capable of eliciting such urgent, even painful yearning. Few sentiments are at once as honest and as absurd as the one that moves us to declare, life would be perfect if I lived in that house. I'm writing this book in homage to that sentiment, which is to say, I'm telling the story of a very imperfect life lived among very imperfect houses. If there's anything I've learned over the many years and my many moves, it's this. A house is not the same as a home. Despite certain Muzak-sounding catchphrases of the real estate world, home buyer, home sales, home loans, the words house and home are not interchangeable. You buy a house, but you make a home. You do not shop for a home any more than you'd shop for a life. And by way of explaining how easy it can be to lose track of these definitions, I need to lay out a few things about the home I grew up in and the homes my parents came from before that. I need first of all to say that we were not unhappy. Not acutely and not most of the time anyway. Instead, what characterized our little unit, my parents, my brother, and me, was a chronic, lulling sensation of being aboard a train that was perpetually 2 stops away from the destination we had in mind for ourselves. And while I have to emphasize that the reasons for that aren't ultimately related to moving, or even to the fact that we tended to talk about moving in the same salivating should we or shouldn't we tones in which some families talk about far-flung ski trips, I don't think it's a stretch to say that our lack of enthusiasm for ourselves had a lot to do with our perpetual curiosity about what possibilities for happiness might lie at the destination point of a moving van. We weren't much for card games or sports, but we knew how to escape from places. And if you're looking for examples of people who escaped their humble beginnings, my parents qualify. My mother was born in 1942 in Carbondale, Illinois, a coal mining town that also happened to be a university town. Carbondale is near the southern tip of the state, 100 miles southeast of St. Louis and 200 miles north of Memphis. And due to a constellation of factors, not the least of all having a difficult, childlike mother who was threatened to the point of hysterics by anything that hinted of intellectual ambition, my grandmother forced my mother to twirl the baton and forbade her from attending the university lab school because it was uppity. My mother loathed anything associated with her hometown and its environs. When I was growing up, she invoked Carbondale as though offering an excuse. It was both a form of self-flagellation and a rationale for any perceived shortcoming. Well, when you're from Southern Illinois, you fill in the blank. Can't use chopsticks. Have never been to Europe. Aren't really sure what Passover is. Can't quite get behind psychotherapy. In a family that specialized in judgment and criticism, that quickly grew bored with all that was innocuous or inoffensive or even pleasant, but loved to chew on grievances as though they were slabs of meat on the bone, Southern Illinois was the original sin. My mother chafed at all of it, the hillbilly intonations of the regional accent, the limited cultural offerings of the community, dinner theater, Elks Club polka, the deep-fried cuisine, the ubiquitous polyester clothing, the knee-jerk political leanings, the xenophobia, the poverty, the heat, the humidity, the tangy efflux of the hickory and crabapple trees themselves. The result was that her life became devoted almost exclusively to the cause of being the opposite of these things, to being educated, well-spoken, with it, and above all, sophisticated, or at least the version of sophistication she imagined when she surveyed her home life and conjured a view 180 degrees in the other direction. Lacking the financial or familial support to leave town, my mother enrolled in the local university and began assembling the tools necessary for her eventual escape. She became an accomplished pianist. She learned how to speak with clarity and confidence. Perhaps most important, she's explained this herself, it's not just my conjecture, she dated a guy whose parents seemingly knew a thing or two about the world. Sure, they were from Carbondale, but their house had books and records. It also had the New Yorker magazine. On visits to their house, my mother would flip through the mysterious pages as though she were glimpsing a distant, dazzling land. And even though she turned down her suitor's marriage proposal because he was ultimately dull, she never forgot the portal those magazine pages provided into a befuddling but obviously superior world. It wasn't so much that she wanted to live in New York. That would come later and with a vengeance, as that she wanted to live in a place that resembled the kind of place that a person who read The New Yorker would live. Her primary means for this ambition, houses. She wasn't blessed with a willowy body type that might otherwise have made fashion her canvas, nor did she have an aptitude for foreign language or interest in travel that could have made her genuinely cosmopolitan. Her younger brother, for his part, escaped the muck of their childhood by growing up to be an inveterate globetrotter. But she knew what to do with paint colors, with curtains, with furniture. In fact, she had more than a few shades of brilliance on that front. Despite having grown up in a nondescript one-story house with no art on the walls and no books on the shelves, she had her share of opinions, however vague, about the kind of art, not from Sears, and books, not dime store paperbacks, that would line the perimeters of the homes of her future. And like a musician who could play by ear, she had the ability to conjure a room in her head and recreate it in 3 dimensions. Given her generation and resources and station in life, my mother believed that the best context for such a lifestyle was affiliation with a university. Not that she wanted to be an academic herself. She wanted to be an academic wife. Thus, she kept her eyes peeled for someone whose cautious, non-committal bohemianism would mesh with her own, and with any luck, help supply her with the ultimate proof that she had transcended her origins. An elegant yet understated house with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, the perfunctory hardwood floor oriental rug combo, and a kitchen stocked with hanging copper pots and a copy of the Moosewood cookbook. This was my mother's vision in the mid-1960s, minus the Moosewood, which didn't pub until 1977, but even in the days before Woodstock, surely was a twinkle in the eyes of an entire generation of women. This was what she believed she wanted. Not a career, not even the life of a genuine intellectual, but the trappings of that kind of life. She wanted the house, the rugs, the shelves. So was it blind faith my mother brought to the table the day she decided? And I have no doubt that she was decisive in the matter. It's a skill I've always admired in her, but didn't fully inherit. That my father was the train to which she was hitching her almost violent need to transform herself. Did she simply love him for the sake of loving him? Or did she look at him and catch some vision of an educated, well-spoken, and sophisticated life? Did she see in him some iteration of a New Yorker cartoon character? Not beyond the realm of possibility, given his prominent nose and the mad professor tufts of hair that flanked his already bald pate, and conclude via a series of unconscious calculations that of all the grad students in the music department of Southern Illinois University, he was the one most likely to help her succeed. I'm going to skip ahead. I guess I have to fill you in with my father. So my parents were married in 65, and my father is a composer. He was like this sort of savant genius person, big career ahead of him. Pursued an academic track because they didn't really know what else to do. They went to Palo Alto to Stanford, so my father got a PhD in music, which don't do it. And then we were in Chicago for a while, and then in Austin, Texas, where he was teaching, and he didn't get tenure just because he's not that kind of a guy. And we ended up moving to the suburbs of New York City so my father could pursue a career as a freelance jingle writer. So I'm going to pick up from where we were. This is when we're living in New Jersey in the early 1980s. My parents were obsessed with New York, its mythologies, its towering density, its promise of high-powered talent pools and professional opportunities. But they were also cowed by it, and understandably so. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was dangerous and dirty. And given the way the squalid, hooker-filled Port Authority bus terminal bookended just about every one of our trips in for New Jersey, just ever so slightly third world in its ambiance. My father was once mugged at knife point. Another time, a small girl romping down a Hell's Kitchen street errantly threw a piece of metal shrapnel in his direction. It hit him in the face and caused profuse bleeding, and the girl ran away terrified. This was the era of the removable car radio. And whenever we drove into the city, my father would pop out the cassette deck and hand it to my mother to carry in her purse. Still, my father often spoke of the perils of New York, particularly the West Side Midtown neighborhoods where he was attempting to do business, with a certain relish, almost as though he were bragging. Well, New York is great, but it's not quite civilized, I'd hear him say on the phone to friends in faraway places who we all imagined were marveling at the scope of our ambition. There's a sense of lawlessness. The city will eat you alive. I can see how a lot of people just wouldn't be able to handle it. Both of my parents, my mother especially, were fond of suggesting to various Midwestern and Texan friends and relatives that we actually lived not in New Jersey, but rather in some kind of staging area between the vacuous suburbs and the head rush of Gotham. Yes, the address says New Jersey, my mother would say, but we're just right over the border from Manhattan, just right there, very close. This was not true. We were completely and utterly in New Jersey. We were 20 miles away, and it was a long 20 miles, psychologically, if not geographically. Still, as though standing at the western mouth of the Lincoln Tunnel and trying to see a sliver of light from the other side, my parents peered at their dream lives from afar and did everything they could to convince themselves that they were wide awake and living them. Many days, my father would go into New York, and as he put it, hustle for work. I'm pretty sure that no one, let alone him, entirely understood what this needed to entail. He didn't have an agent or a rep, and to this day has never felt he needed one. But my perception was that he functioned as something like a traveling salesman for himself. He dropped up his demo tape to music production companies and ad agencies. He had lunch with people who, presumably, were in a position to hire him. He was assaulted by little girls and mugged. Mostly it seemed, however, that he walked around the city, particularly the seedy midtown neighborhoods on the west side that housed various recording studios and the Musicians Union and restaurants frequented by players in pit orchestras of Broadway shows. And amid all this pavement pounding, his unconscious disbelief that he'd actually made it that far out of Centralia, Illinois, became the collective unconscious of our family. "I was just there," my father would exclaim whenever a Manhattan landmark appeared on television. "Walked down that street just today. That's Broadway and looks like 54th Street. Nope, 55th. I was just there. Had my meeting on 57th Street and walked south to the Port Authority. Yes, I know exactly where that is. Know it well." We went through 2 houses in Ridgewood, the small rented Tudor, and later a slightly larger turn-of-the-century house in the American Foursquare style on a street I'll call Jones Lane. In each of these houses, my parents maintained 2 telephone lines, one for normal family-related matters, and one called the business line, which was designated for my father's work and was never to be picked up by children. Though she denies it, I swear that once or twice my mother answered and impersonated a professional receptionist. An answering machine, a technological marvel, hooked up to the business line, delivered an authoritative message designed to give the caller the impression that this was no house in suburbia, but rather a bona fide professional operation. 2 separate phone lines was an exotic household feature in 1979. More exotic still was the ability to retrieve messages from remote locations using a small beeper that emitted a tone that would rewind and play the tape. I don't know if this feature preceded the technology wherein you check messages by simply pressing a phone pad key, or if my parents, likely my father, had chosen this particular model out of some belief that it was superior to the more conventional system. We were a Betamax family, so that should tell you something. But I remember clearly that the beeper, which was activated by a push button that had no lock, would sputter out electronic hisses as it got tossed around in my mother's oversized purse. As a result, when she walked around, she often gave the impression of being attached to some kind of homing device. Once, she sat her purse down on a supermarket checkout counter, only to have the beeper emit a solid, unrelenting tone that, in her efforts to dig it out of her bag, caused her to spill the entire contents onto the conveyor belt and onto the floor. I remember being terrified that she was going to explode into a rage. I remember that I was sheepishly holding a candy bar that I was about to implore her to buy, and that the clerk, a high school student with fashionably feathered back hair and a gold cross around her neck, looked at us as though we'd accidentally wandered into the store from some faraway land of disheveled women carrying strange technological gadgets. That is to say, she looked at us in confusion, and as far as I was concerned, disdain. Justifiably or not, probably not, but what does it matter? This is how I experienced just about everything about life in Ridgewood, New Jersey, particularly the first few years after our arrival. Even when I was as young as 9, I had the sense that everyone there already knew each other, that every clique was already formed, that everyone's mom knew all the other moms, that maybe there was even some secret underground tunnel connecting the houses so that entire social networks could thrive without my even knowing they existed. And watching that checkout girl watching my mother pick the contents of her purse off the floor, I remember feeling so diminished by what I perceived to be her total, inviolable sense of belonging and our total, inviolable sense of otherness that I wanted to take that beeper and throw it against the frozen food cases. But the beeper was hardly the final frontier in our telecommunications adventures. More astonishing was that the business line had 2 numbers associated with it, a New Jersey number and a Manhattan number, with a 212 area code. The line operated on a call forwarding system, which meant that once you programmed it by dialing a certain set of codes, calls to the Manhattan number would ring through automatically to the New Jersey number. Each line had its own similar but distinct version of the old-fashioned Ma Bell ringtone. And in the early Ridgewood years, the jangle of the business line sent an almost bone-cracking jolt of nervous energy through the house. "It's the business line, Dad! The business line is ringing!" my brother and I would yell, terrified that one of us would pick up the phone by accident. And also terrified that one of our parents wouldn't get to it in time. "Dad, get it! It's business!" Somehow my parents had cobbled together the money to rent a musty one-room office in a shabby building on 40th Street and 9th Avenue. This was home not only to a desk and filing cabinets and an oriental rug my mother had placed strategically over the industrial carpet, but also the official headquarters of the business line. Though it was generally unclear what actually took place in this office, my father's keyboards and reel-to-reel tape recorders, which were crucial to his creative process, were permanently installed at home. The intended effect was to cover up, or at least distract from, the fact that we lived in New Jersey. Business cards and stationery bearing the Manhattan address were printed. A small sofa and a ficus plant were installed in the corner so that my father could take meetings with clients. Though I'm sure a few meetings did occur, what I remember most about the office in Manhattan is how little time my father actually spent there. As for the business line, not only did it not ring with the frequency my parents had hoped, but it had the unfortunate glitch of only being forwardable if you happened to be physically using the phone from which you wished to forward calls. That detail sticks in my mind thanks to the memory of one occasion wherein my father returned home from a day of hustling and making and taking a few calls in the office, only to realize that he'd forgotten to reset the business line so it would ring through to our house in New Jersey. "Oh, hell," my mother said. She had already started dinner. "Well, is anyone really going to call?" my father asked. "Possibly," she said, alluding to this music supervisor or that Broadway show producer. My mother really wanted my father to write music for Broadway shows. "You're saying I should go back?" he said. It was rush hour. It was a Friday. Thanks to heavy traffic, my father's journey on the short line bus from the Port Authority to the drop-off location at the Kmart on Route 17 had taken nearly an hour. "Don't you think you should?" my mother said, with exasperation, if not unkindness. "Otherwise, we're talking about a whole weekend of calls not able to come through." So my father got in the Plymouth Horizon and drove back into the city, found a parking spot several blocks from his destination, walked to the office, reprogrammed the phone, and drove back to Ridgewood. Meanwhile, we ate dinner without him. The business line did not ring that weekend. Okay, I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. What do I need to tell you? Well, so my mother sort of emancipated herself when I was in high school and starting college. She got involved with student theater at the high school and eventually became the sort of grande dame of the student high school theater world in Ridgewood, New Jersey. And that's what I will say about that. The summer between my junior and senior years of college, my mother moved out of Jones Lane and rented a small cottage-like house in an adjacent town. After nearly 25 years of living with my father's moodiness and constant monologue of criticism, she had decided that the cure for her misery was not only a life in the student theater, but also four walls whose color scheme required approval from no one. It wasn't another man she wanted, but another life. Preferably one in which she could drink wine in her sun-drenched living room and listen to George Winston CDs with no one ranting about the music being jejune, and look at the art on her walls without feeling guilty that the other occupants of the house hated it. So one July day, movers came and transferred certain carefully selected pieces of furniture from our house to my mother's bachelorette pad less than 10 miles away. The proceedings, I'm told, were not hostile, but rather so infused with guilt and unaccepted apologies that my mother developed a rash on her neck from rubbing it in anxiety. From what I gathered, my father and my brother simply sat there, swatting away mosquitoes in a nonplussed stupor. I was at college at the time. Actually, I had sort of escaped college and was living in New York City. By the time I deigned to get on the bus and travel the 20 miles from Manhattan, where I was living in squalid post-adolescent rebellion in Greenwich Village, my mother's new house looked like a page from the Pottery Barn catalog. Sleek modernist pieces were flawlessly juxtaposed with antiques. Cut flowers leapt from glazed ceramic vases. The framed art posters that had festooned the old house now seemed to have multiplied. Between the placards for my mother's theater productions and the original, mostly abstract art either sold by or created by her new friends, there was scarcely an inch of blank wall space. Too broke to buy significant pieces of new furniture, and too charitable to abscond with any of the major stuff from the old house, my mother had a living room sofa and chairs made of wicker. Though I don't remember this incident well, I suspect, make that hope, that my mother remembers it hardly at all. I know she led me through the 5 rooms of the house with enough trepidation to suggest the parent-child relationship had been abruptly reversed. "It's cute," I said. This was a terrible time in my life. I was unhappy at college, and the unhappiness was exacerbated by guilt about being unhappy. It just seemed utterly inappropriate to the occasion. Depending on whom I was with, my mother being one example, I could be a real drag, and this day was a case in point. I remember skulking around the house and eye-rollingly pronouncing it nice and fine. I remember sitting outside on the patio and eating a meal of tomatoes, French bread, and polenta, a product my mother squeezed directly from its plastic, sausage-like packing onto an earthenware plate. I remember feeling that she wanted to have some kind of seminal mother-daughter conversation, but was still too shell-shocked to dare to initiate one, a vulnerability I took full advantage of by retreating into near silence. I remember that I later realized that the wicker furniture in her living room was actually the porch furniture, recushioned from the Jones Lane veranda. Speaking of which, the Jones Lane house had developed the half-ghoulish, half-comical appearance of a refrigerator that's been raided by someone hoping to go unnoticed. Like tubs of ice cream furtively poked by stray fingers in the middle of the night, the rooms hadn't been emptied as much as they'd been manhandled into a patchier version of themselves. The sofa and dining table and the better armchairs still in place. It was smaller items, desk lamps, cheap bookshelves, a butcher board chopping block that would suddenly reveal themselves as not there. You try to set down a glass of water while watching TV and realize that the end table was missing. Kitchen supplies would be thinned out in a way that, oddly, was both insignificant and highly irritating. The flour sifter would be gone from the cupboard, the preferred salad tongs absent, the good napkins no longer folded in the drawer on top of the less good ones. My mother has said that the initial idea behind getting her own house was that it would be a temporary arrangement. She simply wanted to see what living alone was like, to know she could do it, to check it off the list of experiences that, by virtue of her generation or her hometown or her own choices, had been denied her. Indeed, in the beginning, her house seemed very much like a young person's sublet. The small things that had been purloined from Jones Lane were my mother's big things. A single desk lamp would light her entire bedroom. That end table functioned as her desk. But given that, unlike my father, she had a regular salary, and what's more, that salary increased over time, it wasn't long before her house was properly outfitted and her supposedly temporary experiment in independent living graduated into permanence. She moved from the cottage-style house to a slightly larger, slightly more modern ranch house. And a few years later, she bought the left-hand unit of a Tudor-style duplex near the Ridgewood train station. The money from the duplex came from selling the Jones Lane house, an event that precipitated my father, partly at my urging, to finally do the thing he should have done back in 1964, before he even married my mother, move to New York City. There he lived, and continues to live, alone in a one-bedroom apartment, whose living room is taken up almost entirely with music production equipment. There he is allowed to occupy all the corners of his eccentricity, his inherent nocturnalism, which had always been cramped by family life, and even after we were gone, the noisy lawnmowers and early closing restaurants of Ridgewood was now tucked into the cradle of the never-sleeping city. As though the non-urban world had been a 55-year nightmare from which he finally awoke, the world, he seemed to forget about grassy terrain altogether, once complaining to me that he'd taken the bus all the way out to New Jersey to attend a 4th of July barbecue, only to find that it was, to his great distress, outdoors. Living in New York, he told me, made him as content as I'd ever been, since he'd never been a believer in happiness. When I was in 7th grade, he'd explained happiness to me as something that exists purely in the past tense. I saw this as a major accomplishment. Years pass, nearly 10. My mother lives happily in her Tudor-style duplex, a house and garden-worthy abode exploding with color and art and flowers and lights streaming through the sunroom windows and Sondheim music streaming through the Bose stereo. She has remade herself. She is a busy, animated, unattached woman with busy, animated friends and tickets to concerts and paintings made by artists she knows. She drives a pristine, pre-owned Alfa Romeo sedan that she has bought from a gay male friend for what she claims was not an inordinate amount of money. When she orders a drink, she asks for an absolute gimlet on the rocks. When she goes on to vacation, it's to Vermont and to the Cape. Her son has gone to college in California and never returned back east. Her daughter has moved more times than it seems possible to count. Her husband is still legally her husband, partly for health insurance reasons, and partly because their apparently mutual love of solitude has precluded the burgeoning of any new relationships that prove significant enough to necessitate a divorce. Ultimately, they will live apart and alone for longer than they ever lived together. When the time comes to retire, my mother finally makes an honest woman out of herself. She moves to New York City for real. I am, by then, living in Los Angeles, summoned back east for her retirement festivities, as well as assistance moving her into her apartment, a junior one-bedroom in an Upper West Side brownstone, more fit for a 25-year-old junior marketing executive than a 63-year-old with arthritic knees. I experience a moment that makes me catch my breath in wrenching self-recognition. On the corner of Columbus Avenue and 78th Street, in the rank, piteous humidity of a June evening, stands my mother, father, and brother, as well as my mother's brother and his longtime girlfriend, who, fresh off recent travels to Bali or Singapore or God knows where, have come up from their home in Miami. A moving van will come later, but we've spent the afternoon unloading a couple of car trips worth of items my mother, for some reason, hadn't wanted to put on a moving truck. Pieces of art, pieces of pottery, wicker baskets stuffed with blankets and dishes. We move them into the second floor walk-up and are now en route to dinner. "Is that the Museum of Natural History?" my uncle inquires. "Well, I'll be." To which my mother tosses her head to the side and says, "Well, yes. And there's plenty more great stuff where that came from, like really good restaurants and a bar I love and excellent theater and really great stores." She already knows it well, she explains to my uncle and his girlfriend, both of whom are wearing pastel shirts and white pants, and neither of whom is sweating nearly as much as my parents and my brother and me, who are all dressed at least partly in black. "She'd been coming into the city for years," my mother continued. "This is really a natural progression. She is really quite at home on these streets. That way is south," she says, pointing to the traffic flow on Columbus Avenue. "Central Park West is the next one over, and it goes north and south." She knows it. She knows it well. And of course, not at all. But she knows that too. As with my father's long ago cries of, "I was just there," when the Chrysler Building flashed across the television screen during an American Express commercial, her ambition is on a collision course with her innocence, and no one or nothing is to blame except the legacy of striving and all its ruthless discontents. I'm looking at my mother, but I might as well be flipping through snapshots of my own most vulnerable moments. There I am pretending to know my way around school, even though I'm the new kid and can barely find the door. There I am in high school pretending to be friends with people I barely know. There I am in college pretending not to be miserable. There I am as an adult pretending that I don't feel like a child. And as we stand on that corner waiting for the crosswalk light to change, I can see my mother bending over so far backward in an effort to erase the vestiges of her past that I'm afraid her spine will crack right then and there. I want to hug her as much as I want to hit her, but the signal changes and we proceed forward. I'll stop there.
You guys know about the Allowed series. Megan was interviewing Lionel Shriver, who's written multiple novels and has a new one out. And you asked her this great question, and I told you I was going to throw it back at you. You said to her, you told her that you thought she wrote essayistic novels, and that her books are issue-oriented, and that she's in some sense working out a problem with each of her fictions. And you asked her, what came first for you, the issue or the plot? And so I'm asking you,
Well, this book doesn't have a plot, so definitely a series of issues. It's funny because I wrote an essayistic novel several years ago, and my agent said, "Don't ever use that word to describe your novel. I don't want to hear that. It doesn't go out of this office. Don't ever use the word essay. It's so unsexy. Nobody will buy it. It's a turn off. Yuck." So I tried not to say that, but I am somebody who's much more idea-oriented than story-oriented. I'm not like a really good storyteller. I think this is why I have not managed to make any money, writing for TV or anything like that, because I just don't have like a story sensibility. I'm very much into themes and ideas and kind of working out problems, or just not even working them out, just posing a series of questions, perhaps. So I'm not going to talk about the novel so much, but I had written this novel that was very much centered around a set of ideas that I wanted to explore, and what I did was just kind of created a plot around it in order to explore those ideas. For this is nonfiction, and I'm much more comfortable writing nonfiction. I love essays. I will use that word. I'm comfortable with it. Perfectly.
You're out.
I'm a feminist and an essayist. What can I say? So I had, I was going to write nonfiction, and I think that this book, it's not, the section that I did at the beginning in the first chapter is about my family, but it's not so much about my family, it's about me, my favorite subject, and just these serial moves that I have made. Part of the reason that it's 7 years between my last book and this one is that I moved probably 15 times, and I just could not get my act together. I could not figure out where I wanted to be, or I somehow couldn't be where I wanted, and I spent an incredible amount of energy and time and money switching houses, buying them, trying to buy them, renting them, breaking leases, moving out, and in kind of trying to think about why I was doing this, I thought a lot about my mother, who was a huge house freak, and we would like go to open houses every weekend growing up, and I love. That's hilarious. Don't knock my hobbies. I loved like interior spaces, and I love looking at apartments and houses, and it is a sort of form of pornography. So kind of thinking about that phenomenon and the way a lot of people, I think, engage in this interest, and thinking about how and why I had spent the last 7 years moving constantly, I sort of began to think about how I might fashion it in this sort of cohesive narrative. And it really just ended up being a book about my life seen through the prism of housing and real estate. So, yeah, to answer your question, definitely. I think the neuroses came first, and then hopefully the idea.
So it's often, we heard Lionel Shriver say the other night that she always knows the end before she begins. You say in this book, there's a point where you say you swore that this book would not end with a marriage, with a wedding, and of course there is a wedding. There's a wedding in the book. But did you know where you were going as you wrote it, or were you writing to discover?
No, and I'm not sure I was writing to discover. I wrote up sort of until, I kept writing up to now, and I kept thinking it was over. I mean, it was a very eventful year for me. I was contracted to write this book, I guess 2 years ago, and then, I don't remember. Anyway, most of 2009, that was the year I was writing the book, and my mother she was diagnosed with cancer, and then she ended up passing away at the very end of the year. And in the meantime, I had gotten engaged and was supposed to get married in California at some indeterminate time in 2010, and then it became clear my mother was, she took a turn for the worse, and we ended up planning a wedding in about 4 days and getting married very quickly in New York. And at that point, I had sort of finished the book. It was done. It was being copy edited. I had met my deadline. I had missed my deadline, and finally caught up with it. And my editor said, you have to write a new ending. It's sort of had to write a new ending. But it was the best thing because I felt that the ending I had before was very rigged up. It felt totally dishonest, and I ended up kind of saying something like, now I realize that I shouldn't be so obsessed with houses, and the character's gone through a change, and I'm not going to go to open houses anymore, and I'm not going to waste time looking at the MLS.com and all these things. And that was totally a lie. When you're writing a book, I think you procrastinate. So I procrastinated by looking at pictures of apartments in Tribeca that I could go before. So that's.
So you come from this family of sort of artists, people who appreciate art, people who want to be involved with art in some way or other. And in fact, I found when I was sort of, snooping around, I found this essay that was in Harpers Music.
Oh, music is my bag.
Music is my bag. And I was thinking about you. Megan was originally, not originally, but there were musical expectations in her family, and she was an oboist. So I wondered if you could maybe talk about, I'm sure somebody's going to ask you about writing and how you came to writing, but I wondered if you could talk about the parallels for you in terms of, process and practicing and how it is that you went in this direction and not that one, because you were talented.
I had aptitude. I'm not sure I was talented. I wasn't untalented. I had absolutely no discipline. And I think the oboe is the worst instrument to play. I mean, it was so not conducive to having a social life or having anybody ever want to make out with you. Normally, it's like a real life buster, the oboe. But my parents had said, you're either going to play the French horn or you're going to play the oboe. I mean, could you set it up for any sort of worse life? So yeah, but I played the oboe. I was a competitive oboist, and I played it the all-state orchestra and everything. But I really hated it, and my father would stand over me with the pencil, and it was like crying and screaming and fights, tantrums every day. But as a writer, I think I very much have a musical sensibility. I'm very attuned to rhythm and sound. And actually, I feel like I know almost what an essay sounds like before I know what it is about. So I've always said, I think my father inadvertently had a huge influence on my writing that way. And this is a man who's proudly never read a book. He does not read books. He reads the New York Review of Books. He reads around the books, but he's never read a book. So that's why I'm free to say whatever I want about it. Unless it gets reviewed in the New York Review of Books. So yeah, that's a very good question because I'm very, and I'm a frustrated. If I could do my life over again, I would learn to play the guitar and be one of those insufferable singer-songwriter chicks because it breaks my heart every day that I can't do that.
So I'm going to open this up in a minute, you guys, but just to one more question. It's this business of your father not reading your books, and so you can say whatever you want. It's interesting. Yeah, and people do hear about this stuff. But you are an essayist. You do sort of come from a place of self-reveal, and also you write a column, and that requires that you be opinionated to a certain degree. And so I wanted to ask you about writer's remorse.
That's good.
In terms of...
my parents have that. Yeah, buyer's remorse.
Buyer's remorse.
Yeah.
What about, you guys read a couple of essays this week from my Misspent Youth, and one of them is, you're definitely treading on ground that's sensitive for people. How do you feel? Are you ever sorry you wrote something? Would you ever take it back?
I'm not sorry I wrote anything in that book, because that book came, in some cases, many years after pieces were originally published. So anything that I would have regretted writing, I never would have put in that book. And I do change people's names. I mean, you read the piece about my friend who died, not his real name, not his parents' real name. Not that that changes anything terribly, but
about the
Oh, yes. This is a piece about my friend who, when we were 22, he just got this mysterious illness and died in like 2 weeks' time. And he was somebody who really did not live a full life. He was really sort of an odd duck and kind of was trying to reenact this sort of life that he saw by, reading less than zero or something. I mean, it was a sort of like, it was kind of like a homebody in the 80s, imagining himself to be like some high-rolling person who goes to the Odeon. And I mean, this is all New York stuff, and this is 80s stuff, and you're like, who cares? But anyway, it's hard for me to talk about this piece, because I did not actually ever think anybody would read it. I had a complicated relationship. We were friends. We were never romantically involved, but it was not exactly equal friendship. And basically, he died in this way that was never quite diagnosed, as far as I know. And I got into this strange relationship with his parents, where they would want to. He was an only child, and their whole life revolved around him. They bought him an apartment in Soho and all this stuff. And they would want to go out to dinner with me like all the time and talk about him and want to know all these things about him through me. And the thing is, there wasn't really that much to say about him. I mean, he didn't really do anything. He dropped out of college. He didn't work. He didn't really read. I mean, there wasn't that much to say. And I ended up sort of inventing this version of him as a way of consoling him. And this just became a really very strange dynamic. The reason I wrote that piece when I was in graduate school, I was in a workshop, in an MFA program, and the piece was due, so I had to hand pages in, and I kind of wrote it, and I never thought that anyone would read it beyond this class, and no one really did, and, maybe a year or so later, there was a reading series at this place in New York called the KGB Bar that has, kind of now very well-known reading series. I read the piece there with Elizabeth Gilbert, of all people. It was me and her. She insisted on going second. She was because her friends were notoriously late, so I had to go first. But I read the piece. It was really well received. Again, I never had any interest in publishing it. I did not want to publish it. They ended up making an anthology of pieces that had been read at the KGB Bar over the last couple of years. That piece was in there. I still thought, no one's going to read this. It's like one of a million anthologies. The book ended up getting reviewed in the New Yorker by Daphne Merkin, and she singled out that essay. And suddenly it was like I had been outed, having written this piece. And my parents said, "What is this? You wrote something about Kevin?" His name is Kevin. It was in Brighde. And I kind of had to say, yes, I wrote this, and people were either going to read it or not read it. But it became fairly evident that it was a strong piece, and I dare say it's probably I'll probably really never write anything that sort of works as well as that does again. And it really just it sounds so mystical and yoga and annoying, but it really just sort of descended on me, that piece, and I'm not one that has pieces of literature descend on me. That's a very exceptional case. Everything else, I couldn't even tell you what the structure of that piece is. I couldn't even tell you what I was intending. I don't even think I really reworked it very much. But to answer your question, I would never have written it if it had been assigned by a publication. I don't care if it was the Dirt Road Review that I thought nobody would read. I would never have written it. And it was just by accident that it sort of came into the world.
And in terms of having pieces descend on you as somebody who writes a column once a week,
they don't descend anymore. They have to be lured in. Horrible.
And then of course, in terms of the writers' remorse, I'm sure people maybe want to hear about letters but I should open it up to this group of people. Who has questions for me? Joey.
First of all, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the way that you use words in interesting positions. It's kind of like when you take a defensive lineman and you put him in on offense. Like when you said this about hustling with your dad. That's my question, just to be really fair. Did an emotion or incident spark this exploration into the escape from one's predestined position and your mother's obsession with this escape? It kind of seems like this.
Was it one experience? No, I think it was just sort of like a series of, like, why am I doing this? Well, actually, no, to answer your question, I mean, the centerpiece of this book has to do with buying a house. It's really about I bought a house by myself in 2004, almost the height of the real estate market, just kind of as it, 2005, I guess, was the peak. But, you know, it was a crazy time. I paid a tremendous amount of money for a really not too impressive piece of stucco. And I just kind of went insane. My life, I was consumed with looking for a house. I became consumed with buying it. I then became consumed with fixing it up. And I really was, it was almost like I was unable to do work for a couple of years there. I was just obsessed with the house and houses in general. And so, yeah, I guess to answer your question, that kind of finally made me think that I should try to get something out of this.
Did you pull so many demographics in with that kind of theme that comes throughout this escaping?
I didn't hear the first part of that. You
pull a lot of demographics of different types of people into interest, to be interested in this work because of this theme in America, people trying to escape where they start to kind of move up some kind of positions. And with your mother, it was just perfectly.
Oh, thank you. You know, I think, you know, I like to write about the socioeconomic class. I think the class is, I think I saw Sandra here. Sandra, we've discussed this.
We have. And you have a little house thing going on. You're still looking.
I know. Well, I know. I'm gonna email you later. No, I'm trying to sell my house again. I'm trying to sell my house. In fact, I came here today. My floors. This is kind of it's relevant because my floors are being refinished in my house, and all of the furniture has been moved into one room. And I had to take a shower at the neighbors. We can't go to the bathroom. We cannot use the bathroom because it requires walking across these floors that are being redone. So I had to take a shower at the neighbors, and then I had to, like, you know, I was like putting on makeup with a toaster, like, you know, with a toaster. Yeah. So that's what's, you know, it's just it's ongoing. But you know, I think that socioeconomic class and class identification is really the last taboo in this culture. People don't want to talk about it. They would rather talk about, it's easier to talk about race, sexual orientation. I think it's very, very touchy and very fascinating. And you know, for me, my parents were so class conscious and so needing to not be identified, you know, as the people that they were, which was, you know, fine. It was nothing. There was nothing to be ashamed of. But they were just consumed with transcending that, and there was a tremendous loss that came from that. There was a certain you become unmoored when you are so consumed with being sort of more than what you came from. So it's problematic. But you know, it's the American. It's really the sort of quintessential American phenomenon.
Somebody else? Greta?
I feel like I'm on the edge of my seat hearing the cliffhanger of how the parents reacted to Kevin's parents reacted to the piece.
Oh.
Well, I don't know. They would not. Let's see. I wrote that piece in probably 2005, and I don't think it really came to light until maybe 2008 or something. I think his mother had passed away at that point. His mother had passed away, actually. Because he died in 19... Is that right? I'm sorry, not 2000. I'm totally... I wrote it in 1995. I was 25. I wrote it in 1995. He had died in 1992. So I think it came out in 1998. And you know what? I don't know. his father was remarried. I can tell you, I mean, this is like gossip stuff. This is not like on a literary level. His mother died, his father remarried somebody who's basically our age, my age, his son's age, and has, twins with her. And is apparently relatively happy. In terms of how they reacted to the piece, I don't know. And I'm not proud of the fact that I didn't. I don't really know what I should have done. I mean, I think our friends.
You think they read it?
I hope not. Our friends who, close friends of mine from high school who knew him, read it, and a lot of them were like, "Oh, this is really good." I mean, people appreciated it. Some people didn't. I mean, here's the thing. I've gone into situations where people have been incredibly angry with me about that piece, about many pieces. But I really feel like you're not doing your job as an essayist unless some people are angry at you on one end and some people are like, euphoric on the other end. If everyone just kind of likes it, then it's you haven't really done your job.
So I guess it's a two-part question. Like the people who are really angry, are you just like, you let it go and you just send it?
Oh, no, I'm totally upset and I complained to Dinah and my friends and early in my career, I definitely published essays that were ham-fisted, that were immature, that were the work of a young writer, very in your face. I was developing my style, my voice. It was very sort of aggressive. And, I wouldn't publish a piece like that now necessarily. And I'm much more careful about what I do. I think at this point, I don't do something unless I'm going to stand by it. And I don't set out to hurt people. I really don't think I've written anything in the last 15 years that really should hurt anybody. You always implicate the narrator first. I mean, this is like number one. I'm sure you all know this. Like, biggest lesson. If you make fun of yourself, if you are self-deprecating as the narrator, that gives you carte blanche to basically do whatever you want to everybody else. Because you've set up a tone. You're getting the reader to trust you. You're saying, take this for what it is. It's like that old joke. If you slip on a banana peel, you're a loser. Everyone laughs at you. If you tell everyone that you slipped on a banana peel, you're the hero.
That's great.
So,
that's great. Good. Somebody else. Tom?
I'm just curious if you keep a regular journal and if you use this when you're writing, or are you writing just completely from memory of what you remember the moment you're writing?
I do not keep a journal. I have never kept a journal. I don't blog either. Although apparently they're forcing me to. This is the thing that comes up in memoir. Obviously, like, is this the dialogue? No. And there will be hardcore journalists and reporters who say that's not acceptable, everything has to be sourced. Obviously, what your mom said when you were 5 can't be sourced. So I think that in this category of creative nonfiction, whatever you want to call it, I think that you make a certain pact with the reader that you are remembering this as best you can. Just on a technical level, you just do it by saying, the way I remember it is blah, 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 blah. And that saying, the way I remember it, kind of like buys you 50 pages, where that's you're cueing the reader to sort of take it that way. And then maybe 50 pages later you go, the details are sketchy, but it resonates to me as da-da-da-da-da.
And you had a question. I don't know your name. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm not part of the class. I'm just a member of the public on Zach.
Oh, a member of the public!
I saw you the other night at the library as well.
Oh, good.
And music is my bag. The first thing of yours I wrote, so I'm just really glad I came up because I think it's one of the most perfect things I've ever read. You can write anywhere. I think it's one of the great things about writing, but I also think that where you are, your environment, and literally geographically where you are, has to inform your writing. So it's sort of a two-part kind of open question. You can sort of do what you want with it. Growing up in a family that was so obsessed with New York, I asked this partially of someone who came to LA after being in New York for 20 years recently. Your parents were obsessed with New York, and you eventually got there at the end, and you grew up in that environment, and now you're in LA, which is in some ways, I think, kind of York. So, A, I'm curious just about that move and whether it was coincidental or it was more intentional, and B, being here now, what you're finding that's doing with your writing, if anything.
You mean the move to LA? What that was?
Yeah, and also the fact that it feels like you said you've moved a lot recently, but you've also seemingly recently settled down somewhat in this house, and so.
Well, it's for sale.
Right.
Well, I lived in Nebraska for 4 years, between living in New York and living here. And that's a whole other sort of many chapters that I talk about it to some degree in this book, but I wrote a novel that has to do with that. I was obsessed with New York in my own way. Part of it had to do with sort of, the legacy of my parents trying to sort of fulfill their dreams. But also, growing up in the suburbs, I was just, as soon as I got to college, I realized that being from New Jersey was unacceptable and horrifying. And so I really, I pretty much majored in getting on the Metro North and going to Manhattan and pretending like I was, going to a vintage clothing store and buying something that would convey the idea that I had grown up there. I lived in New York for about, after college I lived in New York for almost 10 years. And I got really broke, and I went to an MFA program. I took out a huge amount of loans, and, the usual, and this is something that I've written about. And then I just took this really sharp left turn, and I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska. I didn't know anybody there, and I loved it. It was great. And I lived on a farm, and I wrote a novel, and I paid off my debts, and I got my dog, and it was great. So the LA move, it's funny that you say it's the opposite. LA does not feel like the opposite of New York to me. LA to me is New York with yards. So I don't. I love LA because it kind of has a lot of it's kind of like the good stuff about New York, but it's also very Midwestern in a way. This is something people don't always realize. It's a very Midwestern sort of, in its way, white bread kind of town. And when you think about, when you think about the way it was settled, the history of it, the way that they would try to, it's kind of like during the Homestead Act, they would try to get people from Europe to come and live in Kansas. They were trying to get people from Iowa to come live in Venice. It's true, and so there is. I mean, obviously, we all know the kind of city it is, but there is an element to it that's very, very all-American. I mean, compared to New York, there's the Costco, and there's the big box stores, and it's a lot like Nebraska to me.
I think you're so right about place informing writing, and it does inform this book. Will you read then my favorite part about LA and San Francisco, and you do a little skewering there on this page. Will you just pick up some?
Oh, yeah.
Listen to this. It's so great. Listen to this.
Oh, well, I'm going to have to quote from my friend. Part of the reason I moved here was because my best friend, Allison, lived here. So her thing about LA was that it was possible to go entire weeks without ever being either chilly or too warm. She had a point. Los Angeles is nothing if not the geographical equivalent of Baby Bear's porridge. Not too cold, not too hot, but rather a study in the unsung pleasures of lukewarm. I won't lie, conspicuous intellectualism is not LA's racket. When Midwestern kids get on the proverbial Greyhound bus and head for one of the coasts, the way my parents should have long ago, the brainy ones tend to go east, and the good-looking, not-so-brainy ones tend to go west. You see them strolling wide-eyed down Hollywood Boulevard, or waitressing at Marie Callender's. Blue-eyed high school quarterbacks who were told they should try modeling, but will be back home selling cars within 6 months. Corn-fed Iowa kids who were the stars of their high school musicals, but just might end up in porn. I'm generalizing, of course. There are a million exceptions. This is only half the story. LA has more than its share of art house pontificators, of pallid bibliophiles, of math types. It has major universities and major museums and quite a lot of independent bookstores. But it doesn't wear erudition on its sleeve. And like New York, it doesn't mind if you haven't read Thomas Mann. It values a nice backyard over the prospect of being neighbors with Thomas Pynchon. Moreover, unlike San Francisco, it doesn't purport to be evolved. The people of LA are honest about themselves and their city. They know it's flawed. They know there's at least one asshole for every decent person. They don't waste their breath telling outsiders how great it is. If San Franciscans are evangelical about their city, always spreading the gospel of its goat cheese and its tolerance and the way that the fog descends upon its holy bridge in Angelinos are Jewish about theirs. Either you're among the chosen or you're not. Either you get why it's good to live in LA or you don't. So that answers my question.
I read that aloud to Fred this weekend, so I just love that.
I forgot.
Thank you for that opportunity to
Yes,
ask about it.
you come to all my events.
You guys, we have time for one more question. Yes.
How much of your work, it feels like when you're, from the little bit I've read and what you just read, it feels like you're just, when you write, you're just piling through pages and pages and pages. How much of your writing is kind of stream of consciousness, and how much of it you kind of come back to and rework?
It's not stream of consciousness. No, I wish. I try to have an idea. I try to think, okay, what do you want to say? And I try to just come up with an interesting way to say it.
Are you asking about revision?
You know, because in her writing, it sounds like, or it feels like she's just going, it's nonstop, but at the same time, they're wonderfully constructed sentences. So I'm just curious if you just like write pages upon pages and come back and do work, or is it?
I'm going to say it's hard work.
Pretty slow. Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's sort of that rhythm thing. Like I said, I know what it'll sound like. If I have an idea and a sound, I then just kind of try. It's you sort of try to construct something, but you have to make sense. I mean, there's nothing worse than that sort of self-conscious writer who's just being very flashy with language that doesn't track logically. And as a columnist, this has been very helpful to me. I've been forced to make sense at least every other week. Sometimes I make no sense, but you're sort of accountable for a kind of rhetorical tracking of thought, which sometimes you're just messing around writing essays for yourself. You're not really. So that's been helpful to me. I mean, sometimes you can't make the flashy, sexy turn phrase that you want to make, or use that metaphor that you want to make, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean anything.
Okay. So there's snacks in the back, and don't forget your readers. And thank you so much to Megan Daum.